Welcome to the Ducks Unlimited podcast, the only podcast about all things waterfowl. From hunting insights to science-based discussions about ducks, geese, and issues affecting waterfowl and wetlands conservation in North America, we bring the resource to you. The DU Podcast with your host, Dr. Mike Brazier.
I'm excited today to be reconnecting with another one of our frequent guests. We actually spoke with this guest a little while ago, earlier this summer, giving us an update on drought conditions in southwestern Manitoba. And he's kind enough to join us again with some new information and just talk a bit more about drought, wetland ecology, what it means for ducks, where we are this time of year, during this year. And so that guest today is Dr. Mike Anderson, Emeritus Scientist with Ducks Unlimited Canada's Institute for Wetland and Waterfowl Research. Mike, welcome back.
Thank you, sir.
As we talked about several months ago now, by the time this airs, you had just returned from a trip to southwestern Manitoba near the Minnedosa area. Minnedosa is an area that is famous within the waterfowl management community, the waterfowl research community. I encourage people to go back and find that particular episode because we frame up some of this conversation earlier this summer. But at that time, you described what you were seeing in terms of the severe extreme drought conditions. And then you also made us aware that you had plans to go back, if time allowed, to go back to the area later in the summer to see how things may have developed over the course of the summer, whether the drought worsened, what effect any type of rainfall during the summer may have had. And so I got an email from you a few weeks ago saying that you had made that trip and we were ready to talk about it and give an update on what you saw. So we've talked on several episodes about how the drought has persisted across the entire U.S. and Canadian prairie. It's maybe moderated in a few local spots based on some rainfall earlier in the summer, but by and large, there's been no widespread relief. But I want you now to give us a bit of a finer scale view of what has happened over the summer in one particular landscape. And you can kind of talk about the difference that you might have even seen in terms of the severity of the drought and wetland conditions as you went from Winnipeg, Manitoba, over to Minnedosa. So I guess start off by telling us when that trip was and then just describe what you saw there.
My eldest son and I were over there third week of July, which is generally a pretty good time to catch observations of broods, if there are any, and give us a sense of how water might have held or not through the breeding season. I guess my overall reaction was that conditions we found were not as bad as I expected. I really did expect it to be pretty profoundly dry. But they've had a little bit of rain there that we didn't get in other places further east. Winnipeg, for example, has just recorded its driest July in 148 years. We had 0.3 of an inch of rain total in July. That's against the 30-year average of about 3.5 inches. So fundamentally dry. But in the Minnedosa region, and this I'm talking about an area of about 100 square miles south of Minnedosa, which has been heavily studied by biologists for a long time. There is still water in the large permanent ponds and the semi-permanent ponds, most of them, but it's really marginal. Water there's sort of small mud flats between open water and emergent cover like cattail on some of those ponds. Other places the water is just kind of right up to the edge, but not really inside the emergent vegetation. The smaller ponds, the smaller semi-permanent ponds, the seasonal ponds were bone dry in the spring, and they're still bone dry. But the larger ponds have held up a little better than I expected. One of the consequences of that flooding pattern, I'll come back to this a little later, is that any broods that are there are really visible. Like normally, especially dabbling duck broods, they spend a lot of time in flooded emergent cover where you just don't see them until they get to be quite old. But this year, even the very young dabbling duck broods are highly visible because there's no place to be but open water. They tend not to survive really great under those circumstances, thanks to mink and gulls and ravens and other things that are looking for little popcorn duck. But we did see some broods. We saw mostly mallard, gadwall, and blue wings, which were the most abundant pairs this spring as well. Just a very few shovelers, scaup, ruddy ducks, some coots and grebes, of course. But we did see some canvasback and redhead broods, averaging about 1.4 per square mile. For the cans,
that would be 1.4 broods per square mile?
Broods.
Okay.
Broods per square mile. Okay.
Do you have a count on the number of ducklings per brood there?
Yeah, they're smallish. For the canvasbacks, on average, just under 3 can ducklings and just under 2 redhead ducklings in each of the can broods. For the redhead broods averaged about 6, but they were mostly a little younger. And of course, the number of ducklings in a brood tend to decline over time, right? As ducklings are lost. But, if you do a crude calculation of the percentage of pairs that you indexed in the spring to the percentage or to the number of broods you see now, for cans and reds, somewhere in the order of 15% of the pair numbers that we saw in the spring are now are broods. So that gives you a crude idea of how successful a population of those two species might have been. And that's low, that's very low for these species in this habitat. But in 1977, 1989, those numbers were 0. So, we've seen worse. Okay, I guess is kind of the bottom line there.
Mike, let me ask you a question there. In those years where you found 0 production, was that driven by just simply lower water levels where the water did not reach the cattail, the emergent vegetation? We talked about on the previous episode how cans and redheads are over water nesters. Is that the biggest difference, just lower water?
That's mostly the case. Just very little flooded vegetation in which to build nests, and the ones who didn't make it. Basically, their nests were lost to predation, which they're more vulnerable to when there's very little cover to search. It just is easy to find them, and they're just in a little narrow strip of vegetation. Yeah, and it was in those years mostly low breeding effort. Most hens didn't nest, low nest success, and there really weren't any broods, so duckling survival didn't really have anything to do with it in those days. This year, you've probably got a combination of all three things going on. Probably relatively low nesting effort, probably relatively low nest success, and brood survival is not very high based on the size of the broods that we were seeing. Saw one old can hen with a 7-week-old single redhead duckling. Hasn't been a good summer for her.
Yeah.
A lot of the redheads, the gadwall, scaup, ruddy ducks that we saw were very young, maybe 10 days to 2 weeks old. And so those broods will still suffer some mortality between now and fledging for sure. But for the cans and the mallards, they were all in kind of 40 to 50 day range since hatch, which you can tell by just looking at their plumage development and their size and so on. What that tells me with the cans, at least, is that there hasn't been any renesting, or at least not any successful renesting. And by that, I mean a second nest by a hen who lost a first nest. So, and you do see that happening in good breeding years where hens will try persistently to hatch a brood. But that's not something that seems to be going on this year, at least not to the extent that we could pick it up on our short time over there. So, yeah, I guess, in general, from a duck point of view, not as bad as I expected it to be, but not good. And the area around Minnedosa where we were working has been harmed less by the drought than some other areas, and you can tell that by both the wetness of the ponds, but also the crops. Agricultural crops here in southern Manitoba are hurting. Canola is probably by acreage the largest crop these days. Wheat too, of course, barley, other things. A little bit of corn, a little bit of peas and other pulses. But they're maturing quickly. They're short. The seed heads are small. Some places, folks are already harvesting it for feed instead of for to be sold as grain. So it's a tough situation for a lot of the farmers, and but we could tell again around the area we were surveying that the crops were still a little greener. They were a little taller. The heads were a little fuller. It just looks like that particular area where we are finding some broods was blessed with a little bit of extra moisture through the spring that a lot of other places didn't get. So I think you'll find that here and there. There was a big rain that went through northwestern North Dakota, and they've got water and they've got broods down there, while the rest of the state is parched and barren. So that's always the case where there's when you get these kind of drought events. It's dry everywhere, but there's a few places where it's not quite so bad.
Yeah, and we have heard that from several of our partners, several of our colleagues. Rocco Murano from South Dakota talked about a lot of carryover water in the eastern part of that state. They're producing some broods and some ducks there. A few pockets in North Dakota we even heard about where they received some rain, some of what you just talked about. And then Pat Kehoe described some rain that fell in some of the more western Canadian prairie provinces that helped things there a little bit. So yeah, it's not scorched earth all across the prairies, but we've definitely heard that it's dry and that drought is pretty widespread. Mike, I also will say that
it's among the most widely spread droughts that I've observed, for sure. Yeah.
Mike, I'll say that I always enjoy talking with you about Minnedosa and Prairie Canada because it takes me back to the summers whenever I worked there. I was fortunate to work there, I think 4 summers in Manitoba and Saskatchewan. And the visual you provided about water in many wetlands not reaching the emergent vegetation and the consequence that it has for visibility of the ducklings takes me back to the field season when I was working there alongside the Prairie Habitat Joint Venture Assessment, and a critical component of that research was brood observations. We had Ducks Unlimited had marked female mallards, and in addition to quantifying nest success and looking at nest site selection, we were also, the crew was also monitoring broods, trying to get visual observations on the broods. And my wife was part of that team. And I recall I went out with her on a couple of occasions trying to locate certain hens and trying to see their broods, but they were in some wetland conditions were really good. Water was all up in the emergent vegetation, and there were some hens where she would have to go back night after night after night trying to get them, because the best time to see them is right there around that dawn and dusk period. Mostly dusk is when they search for them, because in the mornings they were looking for the signals of the hens on the nest. And so I recall even one time resorting to climbing up in a tree atop a little hill perched over the wetland trying to see the duckling, because all they would do at most is kind of come out from that emergent vegetation just a few feet. And so the difference in visibility there is the visual that you gave me by the water not even reaching the vegetation, and how much easier it would make brood observations really struck me there. But I did want to ask you here about your trip to your trip west from Winnipeg, and reflect back on something that Frank Baldwin, in an earlier conversation, described when we were talking about the severity of the drought. He recalled some of the droughts that he went through as a youngster, and even noted that in some years it was so dry that the topsoil would blow off the fields, collect in the ditches, and then they would go out to those ditches, roadside ditches, as a family and harvest some of that topsoil and take it back to their garden. Are you seeing any? Yeah. Are you seeing that type of development yet, or is that likely to happen in the winter?
Not really. I mean, in the early 1980s, when it got dry, there was a lot of publicity, a lot of concern raised about the loss of soil. And that was a time when a practice called summer fallowing was still a fairly common thing across the prairies, where you would leave part of your land unseeded, but till it to help conserve subsoil moisture, and left soils very vulnerable to wind erosion. Also, a lot of farmers in those days didn't direct seed. They would till, plow and till the land before to get the seed bed ready, and then seed into pretty bare soil. That too left the topsoil very vulnerable to blowing. And because of all the concerns that were raised then, and references back to the dirty 30s and the loss of soil then, which is a famous event that most people relate to, a lot of changes happened in farming practices, in implementation, in strategies that resulted in more stubble being left on the land over winter and more direct seeding into stubble. And even if it wasn't a complete sort of zero till conversion, it was still a movement to minimal tilling to try to disturb the soil less. And that has gone a long way toward reducing the dirt drifts in the ditch kind of thing. You still see it occasionally. I remember the road into Okamic just a few years ago. There was quite a lot of soil drifted into a ditch from a farm to the west. But it's much less prevalent than it was back when Frank was a little boy, and then during the 80s in particular. So there's been improvement there.
I want to transition now, Mike, to talk about the drought a little bit more, its implications for waterfowl or for wetland ecology, and then waterfowl productivity kind of going forward. But as I think part of that may take us to where you talk about some of the changes that we've seen in terms of what farmers may have a tendency to do or what they're tempted to do during drought. But I want to kind of give some temporal context here, and I think we may have covered this on an earlier episode. But you live in Canada now. You lived in Canada for a number of years, but you grew up in the States, if I remember correctly. So give our listeners that kind of insight on your perspective, where you grew up, and how long you have lived in Canada to be able to describe, to put this year and some of these observations into context over your life.
I grew up in rural North Dakota and was there until I went off to college. I came to Manitoba as a research assistant at the Delta Waterfowl Station in 1972, so it's 49 years ago. And I first went to Minnedosa that year. So if you count that year and this year, this is actually my 50th year of kicking around on the ground in southwest Manitoba and the Minnedosa region in particular. So I've had the opportunity to see it through about 5 decades, and so there is some depth there. Although, as I like to tell people, I think humans really need to live to about age 300 to develop anything remotely resembling wisdom, given how much the world changes around us. But anyway, about 50 years.
Okay. Yeah, you have me beat. Yeah, I think you have me beat by just a few years there.
Thinking about drought and wetlands, in many ways it can be a good thing, because wetlands, if they're flooded for too long, you tend to see the submerged vegetation, the emergent vegetation, all kind of thinning out and dying back from persistent flooding. The nutrient, more and more of the nutrients get tied up in the sediments, and drying it out does a couple of things. It can release nutrients, and it can facilitate sprouting of seeds in the soil, the so-called seed bank, and the proliferation of vegetation, famously things like soft-stem bulrush that are hampered by prolonged flooding, but are released when things get dry. And so periodic drying of prairie wetlands is actually very important for their long-term productivity. The caveat is that it doesn't have to be dry very long to achieve those positive things. 1 year of drawdown gets you most of the way to the kinds of positive changes you need. And so there's really little incremental gain by keeping a place dry for 2 or 3 years or more. One of the disquieting predictions about changes we may see with global climate change is that both times of deluge and times of drought are expected to be longer and deeper. What we really don't want to see from a duck point of view, from a general wetland productivity point of view, is a period of multiple consecutive years of really dry conditions. There's little to be gained by that. We hope it'll get wet again soon, and if it does, this will prove to have been probably another one of those episodes where the drought was beneficial. But we don't know that. We don't have a crystal ball. We really can't see how long this may persist. So that's one caveat. The second one is that, before I jump into that, let's say one thing. One of the really dramatic things at Minnedosa right now is how much the cattail has expanded this year with the drawdown. Cattail is growing robustly, and there are ponds where we could always see the water from the height of a pickup truck driving down the road, and you can't see the basin at all. I mean, it's really been a lot of expansion of cattail, which means that if it gets wet again next year, there should be beaucoup nesting cover for canvasbacks and redheads and ruddy ducks and coots, everything that nests over water. It may be a killer for the research assistants who are out there trying to find nests.
Yeah.
And all that cattail. But the cover next year, if it gets wet, the cover next year will be spectacular. So that's just one example of the kinds of positive things that can happen. Now, on the flip side, on the downside, is that whenever it gets very dry, that provides an opportunity for folks to get heavy equipment in there and to ditch and drain and bulldoze and fill and get rid of the wetlands that have been sort of in their way for their farming activities. And every time, and I take this back to the drought in the early 60s that I saw, of course, in North Dakota. Every time there's been a severe drought, in my experience, there's also been a spike in loss of wetland habitat, which is permanent. That's, in my mind, one of the most unfortunate things about a severe drought is that it provides the opportunity to do that, to make those kinds of landscape changes.
Mike, I think you've kind of described this generally on a previous conversation, but over your years of traveling to Minnedosa, and Minnedosa, again, you described this on an earlier episode, is in this prairie parkland region, sort of transitional between the prairies and then the boreal forest to the north, where we have a mix of grasslands and sort of aspen groves interspersed across this landscape. Are we seeing clearing of those aspen woodlots as well? And do those tend to accelerate at times of drought? Maybe they're out there and it's an opportunity out of convenience, they just go ahead and take care of the aspen groves at the same time? Is there anything like that going on?
A lot of the clearing of the aspen bush tends to happen in the winter when you can get things like bulldozers in and you're not mucking up any crop at the time. And they can push bush into wetland basins or windrow it or just pile it up and burn it. Now that tends to be mostly a winter activity, and yeah, it tends to be more frequent when it's drier because the machines aren't at any risk of getting bogged down in wet conditions. But I guess a couple of thoughts. One is that unlike in the United States, where the federal government has a pretty strong hand through farm policy and promulgating and enforcing wetland regulations, in Canada, and I think other guests in your podcast have talked about this, it's very much province by province. That authority for water and land is vested at the provincial level and not federally. So that makes it quite different than the relationship between the states and the federal government in the U.S. Some provinces have fairly recently put regulations in place that prohibit the drainage of certain classes of wetlands. Others have not done that, and the regulations vary from place to place, and the rigor of enforcement varies greatly from place to place. It's a bit of a dog's breakfast in terms of trying to figure out what's protected and what isn't, I guess. You're asked about some long-term changes. You go way back to the time when the first European naturalists started exploring the prairies. The area in this aspen parkland area that you were describing, this transition area between the boreal and the wide open prairie, was more prairie than anything, and it was a prairie maintained by fire and bison. When those factors were eliminated, the aspen expanded greatly. Aspen is really aggressive. It many of your listeners probably know it suckers, right? An aspen grove is not 200 individual organisms. It's maybe a handful with suckers that go out all over the place. And so given open ground, they quickly spread. Willow will do the same aggressive spreading. And so the result was that once fire and bison were gone from the scene, the aspen spread. And if you look at the first aerial photographs taken of this area, which was about 1948, right after the war, and it looks like a forest with openings here and there where people were planting crops or running cattle. That's an overstatement, but it heavily wooded. There was just lots and lots and lots of woods. People got after that pretty quickly. Again, with the end of the war, World War II, and the availability of heavy equipment, Army surplus stuff coming back from the war, a lot of bulldozing, a lot of clearing happened, and there was a dramatic change in the amount of woods on the ground in this area, and it was opened up to mostly small grain farming, although some people were growing forage and raising cattle, but it was mostly small grain farming. And when you look at photographs, compare, say, a set of photographs from 1948 and 1961, because there were federal data collected during those times, the change in woods is dramatic. You start to see some loss of wetlands at the same time, but not as much. Wetlands were kind of a secondary consideration in those days. Mostly they were interested in clearing the land to have more arable land to grow crops. And wetland drainage began in earnest then during that drought period in the early 60s, and has continued since, depending on, varying from year to year, depending greatly on ownership. People who live out on the land and who appreciate the rural lifestyle, farmers who are more, my age, a lot of those folks have left a lot of natural features on the land. There are others who are much more aggressive about trying to grow, to make a profit over every acre. They tend to be larger farmers with larger holdings tend to be younger, probably dealing with big loans and mortgages that the older folks aren't, and it's really complicated. And another thing besides drought that is often a predictor of habitat loss is the change in ownership of land, where it moves from one generation to another, and you see consolidation of properties into larger and larger farms. People are farming with an eye on the margins, being able to make a profit on as many acres as they can, and there's incentive to not drive around potholes and to be able to plant what they can, and so on. And so it's an ongoing thing. Every year we continue to see loss of wetlands and some loss of the aspen and shrubs that remain.
Mike, I want to start wrapping this up here. I have a couple of other things to talk about. One, I wanted to just reference this. This is a topic for a much larger conversation and could be a really fun conversation depending on how many people we get around the table. But a lot of what we hear about, talk about, that you spoke of with regard to our understanding of prairie wetland dynamics, response to drought, response to flooding, vegetation change, recycling of nutrients, changing the invertebrate community. A lot of that contemporary knowledge, science-based information comes from a project that you were very closely associated with, the Marsh Ecology Research Program, if I'm getting that right, MERP. They're at the Delta Marsh. And you and I guess just in kind of a couple of minutes, give people an idea of the length of that project. We won't get into all the details of it, but it was a tremendous advancement in our understanding of prairie wetland ecology. So give us just sort of the cliff notes of that.
Well, the project leaders might cringe a little bit with what I'm going to do in 60 seconds, but there were observations that wetland productivity varied a lot depending on the state of the vegetation, the state of flooding, how long it had been flooded, and all that. Milton Weller published some influential work that talked about this notion of a hemi-marsh, this idea of an optimal mixture of cover and water where productivity was very high. Ducks Unlimited was really interested in that because they had a lot of properties that they could manage water levels on, but there was uncertainty about how long a drawdown had to happen, how dry a drawdown needed to be, and how the marshes were going to respond in a systematic way. So the Delta Waterfowl Research Station, and by that time it was called Delta Waterfowl and Wetlands Research Station, and Ducks Unlimited partnered in a 10-year experiment with a bunch of cells that were constructed in Delta Marsh, on the north side of the Delta Marsh, where they manipulated water levels. They did a lot of sampling of nutrients and plants and invertebrates and birds and muskrats and all kinds of things in the cells prior to providing a water level treatment. And then they drew down cells for a year or two and reflooded them for then multiple years at different levels. So shallow water, medium water, very high water, and looked at how the system responded to that in terms of nutrient cycling, in terms of plants, in terms of invertebrates, muskrats, ducks, everything else. And Dr. Henry Merkin at the station was the lead scientist in that program, and you should talk to him about this sometime. But it was a very informative exercise. It also led to the training of a whole bunch of young students, graduate students in wetland ecology, some of whom have gone on to very influential careers in the U.S. and Canada. And it fundamentally changed how DU did its drawdowns. We talked earlier about the fact that drawdowns really only have to happen for 1 year to be effective. And the greatest evidence for that actually came from that experiment. And so there was a lot of useful information that that is still affecting how wetlands are managed, where there is an opportunity to actually manipulate water levels, which is, present in some of the larger marshes.
Yeah. That observation or your comment about the length of time that is required to achieve that reset, that rejuvenation of wetland productivity is what triggered me to talk briefly about the MERP program, because there's a book that has been that kind of catalogs the major findings of that research, and I was looking at that book not too long ago, is actually this summer, trying to brush up on my understanding of wetland ecology as we're here in this drought. And so that was, that's what triggered my memory there, and wanted to mention that. But you're right, there is a who's who of people within the waterfowl and wetland conservation and management community that earn their research stripes, so to speak, started earning them through their participation, either as students or technicians on the MERP program. And that would be a fun conversation to have, and we'll do that at some point. It'd be great to actually go back to Delta Marsh to do those episodes. So we'll have to give that some consideration.
Yeah, it was the first really substantial cooperative endeavor between Delta and Ducks Unlimited Canada, which was also a very healthy thing to have happened at the time. It helped strengthen the ties and provided a lot of valuable interaction between the two groups at a time when it was that the MERP project was going on.
So, Mike, we are entering the fall, and winter will, before you know it, be upon us. And it is, as we've talked with Scott Stevens in the past, it's not too early to start thinking about wetland conditions as they may develop for next year. What we see right now is influence, what we will experience over the next few months will help set the stage for what may occur come next spring. It's obviously dry across the prairies right now. One of the consequences of that is low soil moisture. And we've talked with Scott Stevens about the implications of that. Good soil moisture creates a good frost seal once the temperatures get cold, and then that creates a situation where if we do get snowfall over the course of the winter, then that good frost seal will translate into a larger percentage of that melting snow running off into the wetland basins as opposed to soaking into the ground. And so it's not too early to start looking forward to those types of things. What am I missing with regard to setting the stage here going into the fall and winter, and what we might hope for, do a rain dance for, to improve conditions next spring?
No, I think you've described it very well, Mike. The soil moisture across Canadian prairies is desperately low. It is just desperately dry. And right now, if we were to go into winter under these circumstances, runoff would be dramatically reduced, because the soil is so dry. As it's become warmer, you do get thaws occasionally during the winter now that we didn't often get 20, 30, 40 years ago. And that moisture could be substantially lost if it remains as dry. So, fall rain is something we have to very much hope for, because that will do more than anything else to try to reverse that situation. But, it has to change. It has to change pretty dramatically for conditions next spring to be better.
Thank you for joining us here again, Mike, and giving us an update and sharing with us what you saw, and giving us a bit of understanding on what's happening there across the landscape, and giving people a visual image of those types of things. And we look forward to catching up with you again in the future.
Thanks, Mike. Always happy to do it.
A special thanks to our guest on today's episode, Dr. Mike Anderson, Emeritus Scientist with Ducks Unlimited Canada's Institute for Wetland and Waterfowl Research. As always, we thank our producer, Clay Baird, for the great job he does with the podcast. And to you, the listener, we thank you for your support and commitment to wetlands and waterfowl conservation.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the DU Podcast. Be sure to rate, review, and subscribe to the show and visit www.ducks.org/DU Podcast for resources based on today's topics, as well as access to more episodes. Opinions expressed by guests do not necessarily reflect those of Ducks Unlimited. Until next time, stay tuned to the Ducks.